if we leave our audience, our listeners, with a message, is to making sure that they support embedding community benefits as part of every type of climate strategy, climate project, climate initiative. Community benefits and climate action need to be bound together.
Welcome to Nature Breaking, a World Wildlife Fund podcast focused on the news and trends affecting our natural world and the people and species who call it home. I'm Seth Larson. As we approach the upcoming Juneteenth holiday, today's episode will focus on environmental justice. You've probably heard that term before, but in short, it refers to the notion that underserved and historically underrepresented communities with higher populations of Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color have borne a disproportionate share of the impacts from climate change and environmental degradation. And over the last few decades, there's been a growing movement to address that disparity head-on by raising awareness, engaging companies and other actors that contribute to localized environmental harm, and by changing federal, state, and local policies to ensure better outcomes. So joining me today to talk more about this is Carlos Claussell Velez, WWF's Manager for Climate, DEI, and Environmental Justice. Carlos will walk us through some of the historical impacts faced by underserved communities, what drove those impacts, and what's been done in recent years to put the United States on a more just pathway. As always, please be sure to subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you prefer to see or hear us. And now, here's my conversation with Carlos. Okay, I am joined now by Carlos Claussell Velez, WWF's Manager for Climate, DEI, and Environmental Justice. Carlos, welcome to Nature Breaking.
Thank you for having me, Seth. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation, but I wanted to just start by asking you to tell us a little about yourself. Where are you from, and what drove you to become involved in climate and environmental justice and to become a leader in this space?
Sure. First and foremost, I am an Afro-Caribbean born and raised in Puerto Rico. I'm a native Spanish speaker, and I've been living in mainland U.S. in Philadelphia for the past 6 years. I'm part of a incredible and multicultural family. I met my wife in Philadelphia. She's Korean American.
Mm-hmm.
We have two amazing kids who are a mix of Black, Indigenous, Korean, Asian, white, and other ethnicities as well as
Yeah.
part of our our joint culture and ethnicities. And my background is actually in engineering and architecture, but I chose, as you know, a different career path for personal reasons, a career path that is more aligned with my values.
Yeah, tell us
Um,
about that. What led you from engineering to this environmental justice work?
on the personal side, I guess I grew up in a household very much connected to social environmental justice issues. From my father's side, my mother's side, that was part of the upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
The responsibility to care for others, care for your community, and to be socially responsible. Later, as I developed, in my professional career, early on, I worked as an urban designer, and through that short time period of an experience around working as an engineer and architect, I missed the direct involvement between the work I was doing and social outcomes,
Mm.
and working to make sure that you're helping people, benefiting people, that your work and the projects you were developing, actually you could see the connections between your work and benefiting people. And so I decided to shift, have a career shift, and was lucky enough to, I call it, stumble upon a very unique and special initiative in Puerto Rico. This is an environmental justice focus and community-led initiative called El Caño Martín Peña, that addresses ecosystem restoration, climate resilience, water conservation, affordable housing, and bringing my skill sets in engineering and project management to support this community-led initiative
Hmm.
was, I call, my school in shifting from that previous career path towards environmental and climate justice. So a shout out to El Caño Martín Peña. They were the recipients of the United Nations World Habitat Award in 2016. It's an amazing initiative, the heart of San Juan, the capital of Puerto Rico, and they communities that lead this amazing project have navigated a really challenging political landscape to receive significant funding from both local and federal government to make sure that they can advance these amazing projects. So that was the beginning of my career in climate environmental justice space.
Gotcha. And before we dive too much further into the meat of this topic, can you help us define what climate and environmental justice means for someone who might not be super familiar with that work stream?
Sure. The way I approach it is centering humanity, centering people and communities as part of environmental work, environmental protection, environmental
Mm,
restoration, the policies that we enact and utilize, and the projects and strategies that we develop for the betterment of the environment and natural resources that are also you're centering people and communities. It's not just looking at the environment as a separate entity from people and its communities. And beyond that, it is also prioritizing communities and the people that are most vulnerable to environmental degradation,
yeah,
environmental impacts, the extraction of natural resources, who are oftentimes communities of color, indigenous communities. Also identify. I'm part of those communities as well as being from Puerto Rico, and that connection between my work and my actual life is very much the driver of my decision to center and focus around environmental and climate justice within the environmental space.
great. And just to go one level deeper on that, can you maybe give us an idea or paint a picture of one or two specific communities that have faced challenges in terms of climate change or environmental degradation, and just talk a little bit about what justice looks like for those communities in those contexts? I think that would help ground the
Sure.
conversation a little more.
I think it's very helpful to look at the history in the case of the U.S. Of the 20th century
Hmm.
communities that were located in red line areas, red line neighborhoods that faced in the 20th century discrimination, housing discrimination, racial segregation.
Yeah, and
Our communities that
redlining, we should probably say redlining was a policy that was enacted at local levels in many parts of the United States in the 20th century. And I'll probably not get this 100% right, but it basically speaks to where lines were drawn for different communities to be developed and where highways would be driven through and where green spaces would be and wouldn't be. And far too often, those lines were drawn in a way that was really negatively impactful on communities of color, right?
not only highways, but also industrial facilities, incinerators, and landfills that have been located next to where these communities actually live to this day.
Hmm.
And those decisions of the past, those policies of the past, whether that were discriminatory, even though we have stopped enacting these policies, the outcomes and the impacts of these policies have created environmental justice communities. We see them across a multitude of areas within the U.S. We also see similar conditions in Puerto Rico. For example, we look in Houston. You have communities like Kashmir Garden, Trinity Garden, are communities that are oftentimes dealing with industrial practices adjacent to their residential areas. And also, what happened with redlining in the past is that these communities are also living in flood-prone areas
Mm,
that are more susceptible to climate impacts as well.
gotcha. So the policies that were enacted decades ago are still causing these communities to be recipients of more harm from pollution from industrial activities and from climate impacts as climate change continues to drive all sorts of problems, from sea level rise to heat and more. Um,
Yes.
so, what does justice look like for those communities? Is it changing those policies to create better environmental and health outcomes? Is it moving industrial facilities? Is it, you tell me, what does justice look like for those communities? Understanding that it's going to be different in every place.
It is a suite of policies, an array of investments to fix those harms, those past
Hmm.
harms. but most importantly, it is actions that are done alongside with communities, that communities are part of the decision-making
Yeah,
process, meaningful engagement of these communities to make sure that not only we identify the right issues that need to be addressed, but communities are able to define, co-create, and help come up with the solutions for the betterment of their communities,
gotcha.
and to make sure that as we are advancing environmental policies to reduce these environmental and human health burdens that are impacting these communities, that communities can also see the benefits of that work.
Gotcha. Okay, so I want to talk more about, there's been a lot of progress on environmental justice and climate justice over the last few years. I want to dive into a few pieces of that with my next few questions. And I want to start with your work here at WWF specifically. And I think we can start with the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, which aims to reduce
Sure.
emissions related to industrial processes like making steel or cement. And that matters because those sectors are the third largest source of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. But they also have, as you just said, been historically some of the biggest offenders in terms of disrupting and polluting low-income communities and causing these environmental justice issues. So while we are working with those industries to cut emissions through the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, we're also now embedding an environmental justice component into that work stream, right? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. What has happened in the last 4 years have been very interesting at the national level. The federal policy landscape has enacted historic pieces of
Hmm.
legislation, policies, and investments, and incentives, especially incentives for the private sector, for these sort of industries that are energy intensive, significantly contributing to climate impacts, to incentivize them to advance industrial decarbonization and rely far less in fossil fuel sources. So not only advancing climate mitigation, which is the reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is extremely important, but also while we figure out ways that we advance industrial decarbonization, we are also embedding a community benefits framework that produces social, economic, and environmental benefits for these environmental justice communities that have been historically impacted by industrial practices.
Yeah.
So what we are seeing within RTC, the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, is that is a group of entities and organizations that are committed to advancing industrial decarbonization within the thermal energy space. And what we are doing from a climate and environmental justice standpoint is helping them integrate a community benefits framework to help not only advance industrial decarbonization, but also making sure that we leverage these federal incentives coming from IRA and other sort of national investments to make sure that these communities can also benefit from in these set of investments.
Gotcha. So you just touched on the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about next. You wrote a really great blog post that I'll link to in our show notes recently about how President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, is helping to really get at some of these issues and providing funds and policies to back them up and accelerate progress. I'd love for you to just give us kind of a 101 of what the Inflation Reduction Act has done for climate and environmental justice, and tell us what resources the law has made available and what's it doing to advance progress on this front.
Inflation Reduction Act is a historic piece of climate legislation that not only brings billions of dollars worth of direct investments towards supporting that renewable energy transition, much needed to significantly lessen our dependency on fossil fuels, but also create incentives in the form of tax credits for private sector and for institutional entities that heavily rely on fossil fuel produced energy or heat or all the other fossil fuel dependent energy sources, to rely less on them and to invest in a transition.
Yeah.
What we are seeing within IRA is that a lot of these incentives and investments have embedded requirements for applicants that are poised to benefit from these federal resources to actually develop community benefit plans
Mm,
and develop those plans to being able to transform them into legally binding agreements. These community benefit plans and hopefully legally binding agreements are motivated by four core federal policies, which are Justice 40, investing in America's workforce, engaging communities and labor, and advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility.
Can you
The interesting,
define each of
yeah,
those a little bit for us?
sure. I'm gonna start with Justice 40.
Yeah.
The premise of the Justice 40 initiative is that at least 40% of overall benefits coming from key federal investments in climate and the environment positively impact what the federal government has defined as disadvantaged communities. Disadvantaged communities are a lot of environmental justice communities are part of that disadvantaged communities umbrella. We also have energy communities. We have tribal communities, low income, low wealth communities, rural communities, for example. One thing that we did, interestingly, as part of the RTC assessment when we were developing its climate and environmental justice strategy and working to embed community benefits framework, is that we assessed about 1,700 member facilities,
Hmm.
industrial facilities from our members, and we identified that there was significant overlap between the location of these facilities and a lot of these community categories that fall within disadvantaged communities. So making sure that we are not only supporting our private sector partners, institutional partners, in having access to these federal incentives and resources to advance decarbonization, but also helping them figure out where what are the best locations, where are the opportunities to also drive benefits for communities is part of the work we're doing.
Gotcha. Great. So that's really exciting. And what kind of time frame are we looking at for the policies enacted through the IRA to continue flowing out? What kinds of impacts are we hoping to see over the next year, 2, 3, et cetera?
Most of these incentives are being managed by the Department of Energy, which has opened application windows since I believe the summer of last year, and there have been significant programs and incentives that have been active and have been already awarding funding to a lot of these set of industries. For example, a couple of months ago, I believe in March, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations awarded about $6 billion to fund a total of 33 projects coming from energy intensive
Wow.
industries to advance industrial decarbonization. About $1 billion of the $6 billion were awarded to RTC's member and solution providers as well. So we are in a position to not only support RTC members in having access to these sort of federal resources, but also making sure that we can continue to support them in abiding by that commitment of producing community benefits and delivering on those benefits towards disadvantaged communities.
Wow. Yeah, that's really exciting and really impactful. And so glad to hear that work is going on and that it's making a difference for folks. So, thinking another big piece of climate and environmental justice work relates to adaptation and adapting to changes in the climate and the environment. One thing that is on a lot of people's minds right now, we're recording this in June. Summer is coming. Heat is going to be an issue that is at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, not just because it's summer, but because climate change is making summer hotter than usual in a lot of places. But there's a whole host of climate impacts like that are going to require different approaches to adaptation for local communities, whether it's sea level rise or you name it. So I wanted to ask you what kinds of work is happening or what needs to happen through the lens of climate justice and environmental justice to help communities adapt to those kinds of changes that climate change is throwing at us.
WWF is an amazing history around environmental conservation, and I think when we see how climate change is exacerbating our natural events, natural hazards, provoking like bigger droughts, bigger storms and hurricanes, and during the summertime, uh, significantly increasing the temperatures around the globe. It is a very challenging situation for humanity. In tropical regions like Puerto Rico, for example, like the south of the U.S., we have issues around extreme heat. And just a week ago in India, we we learned from the news that India just suffered from an extreme heat wave that brought over 120 degrees Fahrenheit of heat, even unfortunately causing fortunately impacting people. Like
Yeah.
people are dying of
Yeah.
extreme heat. This is a serious issue that is impacting the world, is impacting the U.S., impacting the Caribbean. Um, so conservation efforts and climate adaptation efforts are essential to making sure that we protect our environment and we protect people. That is something that is part of WWF's core work around climate, and it WWF works all around the globe, making sure that we are embedding climate adaptation objectives as part of our overall conservation efforts. But it is something that impacts environmental justice communities even harder in the U.S., for example. Going back to that conversation we just had about red line
Yeah.
areas, red line neighborhoods, one of the unfortunate outcomes of those policies is that residential neighborhoods in formerly red line areas have very limited to no access to nature, to tree canopy, to vegetation all around. And that creates what we call an urban heat island effect that significantly increases temperature locally around those areas, thus exposing these environmental justice communities to not only the air pollution, water pollution, and soil pollution associated to these industrial practices, but also they are mostly also impacted by extreme heat, which is of a big concern
Yeah.
as part of this work.
Yeah. So, what do we need to be doing, or what needs to be happening to help those communities gain access to resources, to build more green spaces, or give access to more green spaces, so that they are able to adapt to these changes that are now kind of getting baked in as a result of climate change?
Well, a very good friend of mine, Jerome Shabazz, he's the EPA National Environmental Justice
Hmm.
Advisory Council co-chair this year. He always says we got to turn those brown fields into green fields.
Yeah.
We got to make sure that we are um, developing plans and strategies that help address the lack that vulnerability and the lack of vegetation and nature around urban settings. So we're talking about nature-based solutions, enhancing tree canopy, investing in green infrastructure. And this is something that's really important, not only to help with climate adaptation, but also to allow for the betterment of the day-to-day lives of these communities. WWF is part of America's All In. It's a strategic partner
Yep.
for America's All In, which is the US-based largest climate coalition that started over 7 years ago when the previous federal administration decided to take the US out of its international climate commitments.
Yeah.
So it convened over 5,000 members from private sector, institutional sectors, community-based organizations, nonprofits, uh, you name it. Everyone, local governments, state governments, all of them advancing and committed to climate action. One of our most important partners within America's All In is our partnership with the Bullard Center for Climate and Environmental Justice.
Mm.
And the founder, Dr. Robert Bullard, is the father of the father of environmental justice in
Yeah.
the U.S. And what WWF has been doing is supporting the Bullard Center for Climate and Environmental Justice initiative called a Justice 40, a Time for a Righteous Investment Initiative, which supports about 24 community-based organizations located across 11 states in the U.S., all of them advancing community-led climate adaptation solutions locally, and most of them are focusing on issues like extreme heat, like addressing the impacts of storms and flooding. If you go to our America's All In webpage, you will find 3 amazing stories that we captured and shared with for everyone to watch and learn more about what local communities in Houston and other places are doing and how the Bullard Center is supporting them through education, technical assistance, strategic planning, etc. And learning more about this historic figure in the U.S., which is Dr. Robert Bullard, which is an amazing human, and we are able to address these environmental injustices in part due to the work that a lot of important people have done in the past, including Dr. Bullard.
Yeah, I know he's an incredible leader and just a really important person. He's got an incredible legacy on this front. And that work all sounds amazing, and I'm so glad to hear it's happening. Um so I think we can close this out pretty soon, Carlos, and I wanted to just ask, after hearing about all that great progress, obviously the truth is we still have a long way to go on the climate and environmental justice front. Um,
Yes.
what are 2 or 3 of the biggest things that you would like to see in the coming years to make a difference for climate and environmental justice?
I don't want to simplify this, but I I think that one, the integration of a community benefits framework into corporate sustainability
Hmm.
and industrial decarbonization strategies, including meaningful engagement with workforce and community actors, is essential within climate mitigation efforts. I think sustained and continued investment in climate mitigation and adaptation that prioritizes social, economic, and environmental benefits for disadvantaged communities like environmental justice communities and others is very much needed. Um, and and most importantly, remembering that communities need to be part of the decision making when we are advancing these strategies. There are lots of examples of successful initiatives and projects that communities have led, co-led, that have proven being not only extremely successful, but also providing far more benefits that were originally intended. Uh, that example I learned when I was living in Puerto Rico, working with the Caño Martin Peña, and we see many examples and success stories like that uh, coming from the communities working with the Buller Center and an array of efforts across the country. So those are the things that I feel it's very important to highlight. If we leave our audience, our listeners, with a message is to making sure that they support embedding community benefits as part of every type of climate strategy, climate project, climate initiative. Community benefits and climate action need to be bound together.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for putting a fine point on that, Carlos. I think that will go a long way towards making sure that we don't uh, continue or repeat the kinds of injustices that have been made in the past that have led to these problems. And so thank you so much for walking us through this and for giving us a better perspective on it and for helping us understand some of the steps we need to take as a country and as a global uh, ecosystem together to make a better future going forward.
Thank you, Seth, for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit of our work, and looking forward to connecting more around climate and environmental justice issues.
All right. Thanks, Carlos. Thanks again to Carlos for that great conversation. It's so important to understand the historical harms that disproportionately fell on underrepresented communities and how we can take steps now to lift up the voices of those communities and ensure that they have a seat at the table when future decisions are being made. Carlos is doing some incredibly important work on this front, and I'm grateful for his efforts and for his time with us today. As Juneteenth approaches, I hope his words will resonate with all of our listeners and that all of us can think about how we can find more just and equitable ways to keep building a more sustainable future.